Christopher Loss. I'm an assistant professor in Peabody College. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Before I begin, I'd like to start with a couple of thank yous and a congratulation as well. First of all, congratulations to the class of 2012. You've had 4 wonderful years here at Vanderbilt, and here's to 4 more wonderful years. I see some professional students as well, so you've had 2 wonderful years here at Vanderbilt, and you're going to have a lot more as well in the future. I want to thank Dean Camilla Bembo. She's the Dean of Peabody College. She nominated me for this honor, and I'm certainly honored to be with you this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Office of Commencement. They spend a whole year preparing for this 1 week. They do a splendid job, and in addition to doing all the commencement activities, they also help orchestrate these seminars, and so I want to thank the Office of Commencement. Finally, I would like to thank all of you. One of the real pleasures of being a professor at Vanderbilt University is knowing with utter confidence that when you walk into a classroom, you're going to be greeted by some really wonderful, talented students. More importantly, you're going to be greeted by some really wonderful and talented and caring people. And that is all due to the love and support that you have provided your students over the years. And so you should be congratulated as well. This is an accomplishment that you share in as well. The title of my presentation today is Why College? Education and Citizenship in Modern America. It occurred to me as I was walking over here that some of you might actually be coming here looking for an answer to that question. You've just spent 4 years and lots of time in college, maybe 2 years in graduate school, and you're interested to know whether it really paid off. So let me cut right to the chase. It was a great investment. It was worth every penny, and you'll be very happy that you spent 4 years here or 2 years here, whatever the case may have been. Indeed, all the evidence we have before us suggests that a college education, advanced education, pays off more now than it ever has before. College graduates have a greater likelihood of earning more over the course of their lifetimes than non-college graduates. The gap is big already. It's widening with each passing year. College graduates are more likely to be civically and politically engaged in the society in which they live. College graduates are more likely to have intact relationships over the course of their lifetime. They're less likely to go to prison. They're more likely to have a significant other that also has a college diploma. And finally, they are more likely to have, if they have a child, they're more likely to have one that also goes on to college, which speaks to one of the chief benefits of a college education, which is education and learning is its own end, and that it actually is passed on to future generations. Okay? So going to college really makes a huge difference. One of the questions then that we need to ask ourselves is, how is it that a college education is actually capable of doing all of these things? Okay? How did we get to this point? Why college? To answer this question, I want to take you on a historic tour of the institution, from its founding to the present day. I'm a historian by training, and I think that history can provide an amazing window onto our present circumstances. In addition to providing a history, I want to foreground the role of the public, especially the role of the federal government in supporting and extending higher education to increasing millions over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century. I want to do this for 2 reasons. We have gotten to a point, I think, where we have forgotten the extent to which the public, the federal government, supports our educational enterprise, from teaching to research and education. The second reason is the public purposes, education as a public good, is being cast in doubt as a result of the ongoing recession and rising college costs. Anyone who reads the newspaper is familiar with the story that I'm about to tell. Since 2008 and the onset of the recession, college costs have risen dramatically, a trend that continued, or actually that started all the way back in the 1970s. Because of the recession, there has been diminished state-level support, especially for public education, which has meant that families and students are asked to bear a greater burden of the cost of their education, which has led to increased student debt. and longer time to degree than ever before. On top of all this, there have been reports of limited student learning in some college classrooms. There have been scandals around the education provision for GIs returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the unscrupulous activities of for-profit and even some nonprofit educational providers. Okay. This is not a good situation. How did we get to this point? Okay. How is it that at the very moment a public or higher education is more important and beneficial to the individuals who have it than ever before, it's slipping from the grasp of so many? How did we get to this point, and what can we do to solve it? Well, to go back to the distant origins, we might learn a little something about our contemporary dilemma. Here's a 14th century illustration by Dave Voltolina of a university lecture in Bologna. And here you can see the lecture, Henry of Germany, reading from a Latin text to a mishmash of students assembled before him. You'll see we have a student sleeping right here, which speaks to some great difficulty. We also have some students talking here, and we have half the class without any books at all. If you notice in the front two pews, you see students with their books open, reading along with the professor. That is, of course, the 14th century, and by 1500 there were 80 universities in operation in England and on the continent. But this isn't really the story we want to tell. For that, we have to come across the Atlantic and to British North America, and that takes us, of course, to Massachusetts Bay and the founding of the first American college, Harvard College, in 1636. Here's a lithograph from 1750. Harvard College was founded just 16 years after the settlement of Massachusetts Bay. It was one of the most important enterprises that the settlers took unto themselves as they settled on to the new world. And the reason that it was important was because they invested in the college a belief that it would serve public purposes. And you can see this in the charter of Harvard College passed in 1650, which clearly indicates that these institutions known as colleges will be institutions that are given great autonomy and freedom, specifically because they are intended to serve an important, indeed crucial, public purpose. So what was that public purpose? The public purpose that Harvard College and the other 8 colonial colleges that followed that wanted to be just like Harvard before the American Revolution, these colleges were intended to educate leaders for the new land. They were intended to educate clergy as well. These citizens would be educated as virtuous citizens and leaders for the new country. In the kind of education that they provided was rooted in the very education that Henry of Germany in the preceding slide was providing, which was a basic liberal arts education, rooted in the quadrivium and the trivium, in a prescribed curriculum intended to educate students into the mysteries of the past. It was an education that was intended to provide students with access to a set body of knowledge, and the college was intended to preserve that knowledge and transmit it on to future generations. The college education that these students received happened to work out pretty well. It was an education that led by 1776 to the education of a number of the revolutionary leaders. Fully 19 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had been educated at one of the 9 colonial colleges. After the American Revolution, the education, the interest in education took off in this country. And it was led by a number of key developments. One, of course, was the belief that education and that the furnishing of education was important for the future of the new nation. This was rooted in an Enlightenment belief that was shared by almost all of the founding fathers of this country, especially Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but it also extended to Hamilton and Madison and Washington. These founders believed in an enlightened belief in education that rooted education as a source of progress, a source of human betterment, and a source of scientific discovery. So they put a lot of energy and effort into the establishment of education and to the promotion of education in the new country. The federal government, by the way, happened to help out quite a bit in this process. As soon as the country was established and the Constitution was approved, you saw the passage of a number of land grant acts that helped promote higher education across the new territories. In addition to that, we saw the creation in 1802 of West Point, the first sort of federally sponsored higher education institution in the country. This was a far cry from the establishment of a national university that the first 6 presidents of the United States desired, but it put the federal government into the educational mix in a way that it had not been previously. Most of the action during the post-revolutionary period in the first several decades of the 19th century occurred at the state and at the state level and at denominational colleges that sprung up across the country. The denominational colleges were of great variety and mix. The state colleges emerged in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina in the 18th century. In the first several decades of the 19th century, Michigan, and of course, University of Virginia in 1819 established public systems. That system at University of Virginia, of course, was created by none other than Thomas Jefferson, who also happened to be a chief architect of the West Point established in 1802. This was a time of growth and expansion in the new country. It was also a time of innovation in education. In 1833, Oberlin College was founded in Oberlin, Ohio, and at Oberlin, Ohio, they had the first experience with co-education and integrated education known in this country. That was a major development. One of the other major developments, of course, was the establishment of new fields of thought and learning and new areas of scientific research that entered into the curriculum and entered into the college education that had not been there previously. Much of this was a result of the belief that the education that was provided by the old liberal arts college was not equipped to serve the new nation in the way that it needed to be served. So the education that emerges in the first decades of the 19th century is one that begins to resemble the education that would be part of the university model that emerges at the end of the 19th century. See greater emphasis on curricular differentiation, a new emphasis on spoken languages, not just Latin and Greek, which had been the mainstays of the old colonial college and would, in fact, would endure throughout the 19th century, but a focus on French as well. This is brought to us by Thomas Jefferson, who emphasizes the importance of the enlightened learning, and of course, French was at the very crux of that experience. We see a push for all sorts of new reforms, challenging the old education of the liberal arts tradition, the quadrivium and the trivium, a focus that is more rooted in an education that will be of more practical utility. Okay, you see the introduction of navigation and of surveying, the sorts of practical fields that we now associate with a modern university. Here are 2 illustrations. Of course, University of Virginia and Mary Lyons, founder of Mount Holyoke. You see the introduction of women's single-sex education in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Again, this belief in progress and human betterment, in scientific investigation, in the basic infallibility or perfectibility of humankind. Okay, they're not basically sinful. That had been the old belief. They're basically improvable, and they can be made better by the powers of education. On the eve of the Civil War, there were fully 250 colleges or universities or institutions that called themselves by that name. Okay? There was also a growing discontent with the college model that was then in existence. This discontent stemmed from a number of sources. One was the sense that the old liberal arts education, the education that had been passed down from the Colonial College, that was rooted in the preservation and transmission of a set body of knowledge, was no longer applicable or useful to the new nation that was expanding westward and that was having to meet new challenges that required a new kind of understanding of the world in which we lived. The other source, of course, was that many of these denominational colleges that emerged in the early decades and throughout the first part of the 19th century sort of disappear, and then they only pop up later. They are very inconsistent institutions. And in fact, enrollment in college education, even as the numbers of institutions are growing, actually is decreasing by the eve of the Civil War. And so we have the emergence for the first time of a group of educational reformers in this country. No mystery to us in the 21st century, this was a new breed of public reformer who was focused on changing around the education and adapting it and making it a better education for a new country living and having new challenges before it. In 1850, Francis Whalen, the president of Brown College, quoted and said, "We have produced an article for which the demand is diminishing. We sell it at less than cost, and the deficiency is made up by charity. We give it away, and still the demand diminishes. It is not time to inquire whether we cannot furnish an article for which the demand will be at least somewhat more remunerative." A few years later, in 1857, in Georgia, a newspaper opined, quote, "We are now living in a different age, an age of practical utility, one in which the state university does not and cannot supply the demands of the state." A year later, in 1958, the California State Superintendent of Education remarked, "For what useful occupation are the graduates of most of our old colleges fit?" The real crisis, however, in the organization of higher learning in this country occurred because of the Civil War. You have these voices of protest leading up to the Civil War, of course not knowing that that's where it's headed, but it's the Civil War that creates a great crisis in American civilization. Okay? It's that moment when there has to be a new stock taken of exactly where the country is headed and what role education will play. Okay? The sense, of course, rooted in the Enlightenment that there was progress and scientific discovery and that human beings were basically good was brought to its knees by the crisis of the Civil War. 620,000 soldiers were killed during the war. Okay? That's more than almost all the other American wars fought together combined. Okay? From the American Revolution to the Mexican-American War, to War of 1812, Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I and World War II, and Korea. Okay? 620,000. Extended to today's population, that would be nearly 6 million dead. Okay? Raising serious questions about what role education plays. How virtuous are citizens who are really willing to take up arms against one another and slaughter one another in the trenches of Fredericksburg and beyond? Okay? So the Civil War creates an intellectual crisis as well as a real human crisis. Prophetic as ever, Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1867 thought he saw a new future for education in the offing. The treatises that are written on university reform may be acute or not, but their chief value to the observer is the showing that a cleavage is occurring in the hitherto granite of the past, and a new era is nearly arrived. Okay, that new era of being nearly arrived comes courtesy of efforts by the federal government and by educational reformers, a new brand of educational reformers. First, in 1862, the Moral Land Grant Act was passed. In the throes of the Civil War, on the same day, July 2nd, 1862, that President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. Okay. The Moral Land Grant Act provided the states of the Union and later the Confederacy with land, and the sale of a portion of the proceeds from which would be used to endow a new land-grant college, a public university that would be used for a new kind of education, one rooted in agricultural and mechanical arts, a practical education of the sort that education leaders before the Civil War, like Thomas Jefferson, had prophesied as coming soon on the American horizon. The Moral Land Grant Act established a public land-grant university in all of the states. You see here a map, the land-grant landscape, not only throughout the north. You see the red dots from the 1862 Act, but also the stars from the 1890 Act, throughout the former states of the Confederacy. Why do the former states of the Confederacy have two land-grant institutions? Does anyone know? Yeah, because of segregation. That's right. And under the terms of the 1890, the Second Moral Land Grant Act, the former states of the Confederacy either had to desegregate their existing land-grant institutions that dated back to the 1862 legislation, or they had to create separate and equal institutions for the African-American residents of their states. Of course, we know full well that those institutions were never equal. Yes, ma'am? The Moral Land Grant Act was specifically for educational institutions. And actually, we can see a precedent back to the very beginning of the founding of the country with the passage of various land grant legislation, the 1784, 1785, and 1787 land acts, Northwest Ordinance being the big one, that actually set the precedent for the use of the sale of land grants to endow public universities. Okay, so it wasn't wholly new. It was one that was kind of rooted in the past and that was made available to policymakers, led by Justin Morrill, whose idea it was to push forth this land grant legislation, and of course it's named in his memory. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so the first thing we see is the federal government getting involved, and in a big way, for the first time, in the sponsorship and coordination of the nation's educational sector. The other development that emerges out of the crisis and tragedy of the Civil War is this really heartfelt belief that the old college needed to be reformed, and that indeed it needed to be replaced by a new institution, and that institution was, of course, the modern American university. These are educational reformers. I know they're not exactly what you picture in your mind when you think of a community activist or an educational reformer, but in the 19th century, guys like Daniel Coit Gilman on your right and Charles William Eliot on the left, those were the reformers that we had out there doing the bidding of bettering the world in which they lived. Charles Eliot was in particular a leader in this educational reform movement. He was president of Harvard College from 1869 to 1909, and he was one of the most vocal voices in the educational landscape in the 19th century, really setting the tenor for the emergence of the new university, and he helped transform Harvard from the old college into a new university. Charles Eliot published a much-discussed article in the Atlantic Monthly just a few months before his inauguration in 1869, and the title of this article was The New Education. In a real university, he said, it would include, quote, teaching on a high plane and of great variety. It would include a core of classes in the beginning and then electives in the end. And of course, Charles Eliot, building on developments at Brown under Wayland and of course at University of Virginia, he really institutionalizes this notion of curricular election, the idea that students would have the freedom to choose classes that would be of best and greatest interest to them as learners. At his inaugural, just a few months later, he put this in even more clear terms. This university recognizes no real antagonism between literature and science and consents to no such narrow alternatives as mathematics or classics, science or metaphysics. We should have them all and at their best. No surprise, when Daniel Coit Gilman was inaugurated as president at Johns Hopkins University in 1876, that he would basically reiterate the very same ideas that had been pronounced and declared by Charles Eliot a decade before. All sciences are worthy of promotion, said Daniel Coit Gilman at his inauguration. Or, in other words, it is useless to dispute whether literature or science should receive most attention, or whether there is any essential difference between the old and the new education. And in invoking this idea of the new education, Daniel Coit Gilman and Charles Eliot, they're drawing the line in the sand, saying that there was an old education rooted in the liberal arts. That doesn't go away. It gets rolled into this new university, but it's also extended and built upon with new areas of study and discussion and new disciplines and new fields of investigation that hadn't existed in the university previously. Yes?
got these two guys saying we're going to teach the sort of highest elite of the country to be plumbers, and they're not going to go for that. It was only, what, 50 years later that you, or even later than that you started having colleges saying we're going to take applicants from all layers of society rather than just the cream. So there seems to be at least a 50-year disconnect.
That's right, and it's a disconnect that neither Eliot nor Gilman can absolutely anticipate. Okay? The disconnect that exists is they create an institution that is essentially open to all branches of knowledge and discovery. And it's from there that the institution begins to work its way into kind of an expression that is more consistent with the democratic values and the spread of democratic values over the course of the 20th century. So it comes into being.
The gentleman C is this.
That's right.
Antithesis.
That's exactly right. And it's really not until you get a greater mix of students within the student body in the 20th century that you begin to see a lot of pushback on the gentleman C, and you see the actual academic rigor and the improvement in the classroom. And then most of that is brought first by Jewish students who come from ethnic enclaves in urban areas throughout the Northeast. They go to Penn, they go to Harvard, they go to Columbia, and in great numbers. And it's at that point that you have Harvard's Eliot's successor, Lawrence Lowell, who begins to embargo the enrollment of those students because it's putting too much pressure on the Boston Brahmins and others who had thought of access to Harvard as more or less an entitlement that they were due at birth. Okay? So you're absolutely right. You're anticipating sort of that next level. But what we get in the closing decades of the 19th century is the modern university that we inhabit to this day. Okay? It's an institution that incorporates the undergraduate college of old and the liberal arts, rolled into liberal arts classes, but of course into the general education. The Bachelor of Arts degree becomes a gateway degree, and the university is a vertical, hierarchical institution that includes not only education up to the doctorate, but also education in professional fields that had previously existed outside the university structure. Okay? So by the eve of the 20th century, we have a mix of institutional types: single-sex institutions, public land-grant institutions. We have two-year normal schools, and we also have these new research institutions. And that brings up one of the key distinguishing features of the new university as opposed to the old college, where the old college had been vested and concerned with the preservation and transmission of a set body of knowledge. They've been fundamentally conservative institutions. The new university is a liberal institution. And by liberal, I don't mean CNN liberal, and I don't mean New York Times liberal. I mean a liberal institution that is free to think and to discover and to go in new directions, to follow the truth wherever it may lead. It's an institution that is concerned fundamentally with the discovery of new knowledge, not merely the preservation and transmission of a set body of truth, although that would continue, but it's interested in discovering provisional truths, okay, of making new knowledge. Okay? And by 1900, the only thing missing, of course, is students. And here's just a nod to your alma mater, Vanderbilt University, circa 1900, just a few years before the fire that would consume half of Kirkland Hall and, of course, one of the two towers that had existed up to that point. So by 1900, we have a situation where only 1 or 2% of all 18 to 24-year-olds are actually in college. And the great story of the 20th century is the incredible expansion and the growth of the higher education sector. Across the 20th century, you see the number of institutions grow from under 1,000 in 1900 to over 4,000 by 2000, which is a remarkable growth. In terms of enrollment, you see fewer than 2% of 18 to 24-year-olds enrolled in the nation's 900 colleges in 1900. By 2000, the number of students enrolled is more than 14 million, okay, a majority of whom are women, okay, which only happened starting in 1980, although coeducation goes all the way back to the 19th century. So where do all these students come from? They come from three key, they emerge in the beginning of the 1900 in the dawn of the 20th century for three main reasons. One, starting in the late 19th century, there is the passing of mandatory or compulsory education laws that require increasing numbers of young people to actually attend elementary and then high school. This creates a situation where there is also a greater pipeline, and there are more students to populate the seats and desks in college classrooms beginning at the dawn of the 20th century. The other main reason that we see the spike and the geometric growth in enrollments over the course of the 20th century is because of massive student demand beginning in the 20th century. Okay, this demand is derived from a sense among those who are interested in going to college that it can really better their lives, that it opens up more opportunities, that getting a college education is a gateway to a middle-class existence. And here we have a picture from 1928 of Ohio State University on the very opposite end of your own experience right now. This is at the presidential welcome at the beginning of freshman week in 1928. And you see the numbers of students enrolled, a far cry from the dozens or hundreds. Here we have thousands of students enrolled in higher education institutions like Ohio State by the 1920s. And it's a growth that continues throughout the rest of the century. It comes into kind of clear view in the 1920s. At the beginning of the 1920s, there are about 500,000 students enrolled in American higher education institutions. By the end of that decade, it's reached 1 million, which is America's first experience with a truly mass education system. The very moment, however, that system was beginning to flesh itself out and beginning to become more accessible to not just the well-heeled, but also students from the middle class who had more economic and disposable income, the Depression hit. And the Depression caused seismic shocks throughout the higher education sector, and it took some real strategizing to maintain the higher education sector throughout the 1930s. To the rescue was the federal government, okay? Kind of a protagonist in this story we keep coming back to. The federal government provided aid to public universities, including especially the land grants, but also to students at private universities as well. Here we have two examples of the sorts of aid that federal programs provided during the 1930s under FDR and his New Deal programs. The first was the construction of campus buildings at public universities and colleges. Here's a picture of LSU, football stadium, 1936. You see them celebrating the band there in WPA formation, Works Progress Administration, celebrating all of the goodness that has come from the federal government. Somewhat surprising considering we like to think of the South and the former states of the Confederacy as being opposed to big government. Here we have them celebrating it and cheering it quite enthusiastically. In fact, the guest of honor at this particular game in 1936 was none other than Harry L. Hopkins, FDR's right-hand man. In addition, we see another building project here extending beyond just athletic fields and buildings to the math and physics building at Louisiana State University. Over 600 buildings were built using New Deal monies and New Deal workers, the WPA and PWA programs. The other program that extended beyond the public university sector, these land-grant institutions that had a relationship with the federal government, is, of course, the emergence of federal work study beginning in the 1930s. We think of federal work studies to the extent that we think of it as a more modern or contemporary policy development dating back to the 1960s. In fact, work study emerged for the first time in the 1930s thanks to the New Deal National Youth Administration program that helped fund 700,000 students' educations over the course of the New Deal crisis, okay? Over the course of the New Deal crisis. So here is one example of the federal government, of the public, coming to sponsor the development of the nation's higher education sector in a very important way. This is in the area of student aid and, of course, the building of new campus buildings at public universities. The other way that we see the federal government insert itself, quite welcomed, it was also welcomed by these institutions. That occurs during World War II and the emergence of federal research for scientific research and development. The supreme example of this is, of course, the building of the atomic bomb during World War II. The Manhattan Project on the left is Robert Oppenheimer, kind of the mastermind of the atomic bomb building project, along with General Leslie Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers. Together, they created a massive nationwide infrastructure to support and to build the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb included over 120,000 workers. 3 cities, including Oak Ridge, Tennessee, emerged as a result of the building of the atomic bomb. And for the first time, the federal government has a full stake in the sponsorship of scientific research and development. This sponsorship of scientific research and development that emerges in World War II had been resisted prior to the war because scientists felt that it was a mix of politics and scientific discovery that was unhealthy. World War II erases all of those concerns. And ever since World War II, the federal government has been the chief sponsor of research and development at private institutions as well as public institutions. Okay? Almost all the research we do comes by dint of public sources. Okay. Yes?
On the slide we have showing enrollment.
Yes.
The years and that. If you look at, I would expect that like after World War II, because we had so many men coming back under the GI Bill.
That's right.
But you don't really see a blip up till you get in the 1960s and 70s. And I wonder that has to be the baby boom generation.
That's right.
And probably put a demand on it, universities, as the educational system's gotten over that. Yeah.
That's right.
Because put that big demand, because it almost goes asymptotic, goes straight up.
Yes, that's right. And we can sort of go back and you can see that the enrollments begin to really grow. You see in the 1940s, they taper off because of the draft, and enrollments actually decline during the war. But then after the war, thanks to the GI Bill, you see a great increase in the college-going rate, especially for returning veterans who actually populate college campuses at a rate of over 50% in the 1948 school year. And that demand begets yet more demand from other groups, including women and African Americans later on. So you begin to see that growth in the system and the provision of education for students, not just from sort of the well-heeled classes, but especially from the working classes, which is one of the great achievements of the GI Bill. And the GI Bill makes available student aid, portable student aid, to returning veterans for the sacrifices that they made during the war. Passed in 1944. The expectation among government experts was that it would only probably entice 100,000 of the nation's 16 million veterans to go back to college. Okay. There's a report that was actually not very accurate. In fact, 2.3 million soldiers used, or veterans used the GI Bill to attend a college or university. Even more than that, used it to attend a vocational school or some other kind of tertiary or professional vocational education. Fully half of the nation's 16 million veterans used the GI Bill to improve their educational prospects after the war. This created greater openness to the college campuses. It was claimed that it increased the academic rigor of those campuses. But the most important thing it did, I think, from a long-range perspective, is it increased the expectation among other groups of Americans that they too should have a right to an education. And they too should have a right to go to college. You see this emerge almost immediately after the war, because it wasn't veterans who just sacrificed on behalf of the war. It was also women who worked in factories or who also participated in the war. Fully 300,000 women were serving in the armed services during the war. It also included African Americans. 800,000 African Americans served in the military. And those people at home who were on the home front, they made sacrifices of various sorts as well, not least of which was the doubling of the tax rate. Fully 60% of the cost of the war was paid by tax dollars. The rest was picked up by the sale of war bonds. Fully $135 billion in war bonds were sold during World War II. So the American people across the board, not just veterans, but Americans at home, made sacrifices. And one of the chief benefits and provisions made to those who made those sacrifices was, of course, the right to an education. And almost immediately it extends out. And you see in 1947 in the Truman Commission report on civil rights, to secure these rights, a provision in that report indicating that African Americans should not only have a right to education at the elementary and high school level, but also a right to higher education. Almost a few months later, there's the publication of the Truman Report, Higher Education for American Democracy. And here they make grandiose claims about the educability of the American population. Previously, it had been thought that older adults were incapable of earning a college education, that it was something that was kind of sequenced into the life cycle, that it was only appropriate for those aged 18 to 24. In fact, the return of the veterans who were older, many of whom were married, who did outstanding work on college campuses, proved those old beliefs to be untrue. And the gates of higher education begin to open widely beginning in the 1940s and 50s, thanks in large part to that wedge event that occurs with the passing of the GI Bill. The passage of the GI Bill, I think, creates a circumstance whereby successive policy enactments by the federal government are used to encourage the extension of education in new directions that have a direct bearing on the way our educational system works to this day. During the Cold War is the passage of the Surplus Property Act and the Fulbright Act. This helps and leads to the internationalization of American higher education. We also have the passage of the National Defense Education Act, intended, of course, to respond to the Sputnik crisis of 1957, Sputnik 1 on the left, Sputnik 2 with Laika, the space dog. Unfortunately, Laika never made it back from his trip into the outer space, but he was nevertheless memorialized in song and various other Soviet rituals that emerged as a result of the achievement of flying a dog into outer space. On American soil, we responded with the National Defense Education Act, and this act, of course, provided important changes in American higher education. Not only fellowships for advanced study in science and foreign languages, so-called defense-related fields, but also in the provision of student loan monies to fund college students' educations throughout the Cold War. Fully 1.5 million students used a Cold War National Defense Education loan to pay for their college education. Again, sensing kind of the coming of the reliance on loans to pay for colleges that would emerge after the 1960s. Having extended education and the right to education to veterans and then to students in defense-related fields of study via loans and fellowships during the Cold War with the National Defense Education Act, it's in 1965 that the Higher Education Act, which is the main educational provision that is used to support student access to higher education, was passed. The Higher Education Act bundled all of these three mechanisms that we've discussed and made it available to all students. That is, of course, loans, grants, and work study. And the Higher Education Act was especially important for the transformation of African American access to higher education. As recently as 1960, there were fewer than 200,000 African Americans enrolled in the nation's higher education system. This all begins to change thanks to the Civil Rights Act in '64, and then the passage of the Higher Education Act in 1965. By the mid-1970s, over 1 million African Americans are enrolled in American higher education institutions. The seismic growth is critically important for the diversification of the campus that occurs. And again, it's led by well-meaning administrators, but also by the hard-fought victories of the civil rights struggle, which we see enacted here. Armstead Robinson at Yale University, championing black studies. And of course, we see women's liberation and Gerda Lerner teaching one of the first courses in women's studies starting in the 1970s at Sarah Lawrence College. I put these slides in here because there are sometimes questions about the legitimacy of some of these curricular innovations that emerge in the 1960s. I think it's important to remember that the new education prophesied by Gilman and by Eliot is an education that is different from the old one. And of course, the curriculum and the higher education system that we have inherited has changed over time as well. Colleges and universities are mirrors of the students and the society that they serve. And these are two important expressions of the kinds of ways in which rights consciousness that begins in the 1960s and is extended into the 1970s actually comes to change in very important ways the tenor of our curricular offerings in higher education beginning in the 1970s and ever since, extending to other fields as well, fields that many of you have no doubt taken in the course of your own educations. Okay, so what does the sector look like by the end of the 20th century? We have a sector that is incredibly diverse, especially in comparison to the beginning of the century. Even as recently as 1960, we see 30% of undergraduate students come from so-called diverse backgrounds or populations. This is a seismic transformation in the nature of college going in this country. We also see a transformation that is less positive, I think, and it's hard to size it up in any other way. Here is the transformation in trends in federal student aid in current dollars from 1960s through the first decade of the 21st century. And we see a trend that begins after the 1965 Higher Education Act that privileges the use of grants, okay, which is fundamentally a right to education in this country, that is eclipsed quite quickly by the mid-1980s by loans as the main mechanism by which students pay for their college educations. This is a trend that continues to this day, and it's one that I think has really set us off in an area of discussion and debate around higher education. Has too much of the burden been passed on to students? What role can colleges play? What role can the federal government play? I think the current debates boil down to a number of things. One, decline of public state level support, which has reached less than 8% nationally as of this year. High student attrition. Okay? 60% of students graduate in 6 years in this country. Okay? Vanderbilt obviously is not one of those institutions, but that's the national trend. The average loan debt per college graduate last year was $25,000. There have been reports of limited student learning. We've probably read about some of those things in the newspaper and elsewhere. And of course, there's high unemployment. So what are the proposals to fix this situation? Well, there have really been two, and you can kind of chalk them up to the different sides of the political spectrum. One, of course, is more regulation. President Obama suggested as much in his last State of the Union address. The other response, of course, is less regulation, okay? Kind of encroaching toward the free market, letting the market determine winners and losers. I read just a couple weeks ago, David Brooks had a bit in the New York Times on Sunday where he was basically advocating that we should go in this route. It would actually even out the higher education marketplace and create a better, more efficient institution. I think that both of these proposals are probably off the mark. Okay? Higher education from the very founding of Harvard College has always been a public good. Okay? In the course of the discussion we've had today, we've seen the role of the public in sponsoring and supporting and nurturing the higher education sector. Not just public universities and colleges since the passage of the Morrill Act, but also private universities like Vanderbilt. Okay? If you look at the three key sources of revenue that Vanderbilt has at its disposal, the first is, of course, medical fees from the medical college and hospital. Okay? Those are heavily subsidized by federal sources, Medicare, Medicaid, and the like. The second key source is, of course, student tuition revenue. Student tuition is heavily subsidized as well in this country by various mechanisms, grants, loans, and of course, work study. The third mainstream is federally sponsored research. Last year, Vanderbilt University did $600 million in sponsored research. Over 90% of that came, you guessed it, from the federal government. So we ought to rethink the way in which we are talking about the privatization of higher education, or whether it's a public good. Of course it's a public good. The public invests heavily in higher education, not just at Vanderbilt, but at Harvard and MIT, University of Virginia, and other public universities that recently have been talking about going private. They couldn't operate and fulfill their mission of research and service and teaching if not for the public support. I think by shifting the discussion around the publicness of the institution and the ongoing public commitment that is there and has been there and remains there, then we should really rethink the ways in which we make the institution available to the students that we are supposed to serve. I mean, diversity becomes a moral imperative when you realize that it is the public that is paying into the system, and so the public should have access to it. Finally, I think one of the ways that we've talked about changing this situation and improving the higher education sector is by kind of increasing economies of scale, looking to digital distance learning, looking to ever larger classes with ever fewer teachers. I think this is a big mistake. One of the real beautiful things about being a college professor is coming into venues like this with students where you actually get to talk with one another and learn from one another. It's one of the most important things that we do in higher education. Daniel Coit-Gilman at his inauguration said we have the freedom to research. We have an obligation to teach. And what could be more public than that? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your time today. We have time for questions if anyone wants to ask them.
See the future of online education. I mean, obviously, University of Phoenix is kind of, is that a new? I mean, obviously, it's a new concept.
Sure.
Where is Vanderbilt?
So the question is the future of online education. I think the future is going to be one that's very much up for grabs. I mean, the idea of educating from a distance goes all the way back to the 19th century. There was correspondence study. In the 1920s and 30s, we saw the emergence of education by radio, enterprising, especially public land-grant institutions that had that sort of extension mission built into them. They got behind that effort. In the 1950s, there was a whole effort with education by television. It was one of the roots of public broadcasting system in this country. Was linked to the Ford Foundation's investment of over $150 million into educational television. So we have a long history of trying to educate from a distance. I think in more recent years, computer technology, and especially the internet, has changed that the playing field in a significant way. And we're at a point now where the majority of teacher certifications, for example, in this country, are now done via distance learning of some sort. At Vanderbilt University, we've been very judicious in not walking down that path. This is a residential university. We do residential education. And I think that the payoff is in the sorts of experiences that our students have. And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that digital distance learning of the sort you've suggested, while it can be appropriate for some individuals and some students, I think most of the times you get into situations where the evidence suggests that it's not nearly as clear-cut and that the outcomes are highly, highly suspect. Yes, sir.
You really think you'll be able to resist the siren call of the internet?
Well,
Harvard, MIT have just said we're going to...
And they're putting their courses and making them available. I think there's going to be, I think actually the shift there is towards greater openness, which is slight. Which is slightly different than kind of getting into the digital distance education game. I think providing access and talking about extending the public good by making the educational opportunities available to a wider public is something that's somewhat different than digital distance learning, even though it's being provided that way.
I think what's going to happen is a more public admission that the function of college is not necessarily taking courses or education, that it serves a societal selection function. And, you know, at some point we're going to admit, yeah, you can take all these courses all you want, but, you know, still the people who pay the $50,000 or whatever and show up and reside here for 4 years, they're going to somehow gain some special advantage. Otherwise, the whole pricing model is going to collapse. Nobody's going to pay for it.
And I think that's actually one of the important elements of the whole kind of current debate and discussion. It's a lot like the healthcare debate and discussion. If we're going to reform healthcare, we have to know what it costs to make a patient better. All right. If we're going to reform the pricing structure of higher education, which is certainly a hot issue, we have to know what it actually costs to educate a student. So I think one of the trends that is highlighted by the provision of courses by MIT and Harvard, for example, is this push towards greater openness. And I think actually one of the things that's going to happen in especially first public education and then elsewhere is I think students and their families are going to want to know exactly what they're getting for the cost of the education. Where does their money go? And so greater transparency, I think, is one of the offshoots of this movement. I think that what's happened at Harvard and MIT is sort of a part of that larger trend. Other questions? Yes, sir.
When did tenure come into the mix?
Sure. Tenure and this notion of appointment without term emerges with the emergence of the American university in the decades around the turn of the 20th century. Prior to the formation of the American Association of University Professors and the provision of tenure guidelines in 1915, faculty had served more or less at the whim of the board and the president, and they could be summarily dismissed without cause or due process for really any reason. Most of the academic freedom and tenure questions that emerged in the decades around the turn of the 20th century turned not on conduct or in the classroom, but on activities outside the classroom, especially around the mobilization of organized labor and some professors, especially in economics, getting involved in those kinds of activities, and then falling in disfavor among boards and trustees and so on. So academic freedom is a byproduct of the kind of organization of a guild of professional scholars beginning in the turn of the 20th century. And then it's also one that becomes almost a functional necessity as knowledge becomes increasingly specialized. It's no longer possible for presidents and administrators or trustees to gauge the quality of their faculty's work. It requires peer review. And that is also another key function. So the administrative and accountability mechanisms that are put in place around the new university are very much a mode of self-regulation. And it's still the same mode that we use to this day, peer review, tenure, all that autonomy that is vested in the institution, it kind of plays out in that way, even to this day. Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Here and then here.
you were speaking in terms of the early idea and how early public education, the concept began, where it would be taxpayer.
Yes.
But there's never any talk about private philanthropy, and I'm just curious about the degree to which, or how they shook up. In other words, how much was the contribution by private philanthropy as opposed to
Sure.
the public expenditure?
Yeah, that's a good.
Have any
Good.
studies ever been
Sure,
done?
sure. I mean, one of the best examples, of course, is the founding of Vanderbilt, with a $1 million bequest from Cornelius Vanderbilt. You see all of the major kind of new research universities that emerge after the Civil War. University of Chicago is endowed by the Rockefeller family. Johns Hopkins University is endowed with private Gilded Age wealth. Stanford University, Leland Stanford University, is founded by and funded by Leland Stanford Sr. and his wife, and on down the line. So private philanthropy plays a very important part in the founding and establishment of these institutions. Duke University, same sort of thing. One of the things about philanthropic gifts to universities is that they often come tied with lots of restrictions that limit the ways in which those funds can be used, okay, especially when they're endowed, but even gifts that go into other areas. They're often restricted funds. So that's one of the main issues. Private universities are in a slightly different place than the publics. Publics had never had the tradition of those kinds of gifts and of using philanthropic funds in the same way that private universities have. They've started to do that now, and they've been doing it for a long time, but they still don't have the sorts of resources that some of the elite private universities do. Question here, ma'am.
Where do you place vocational education?
Well, I think vocational education increasingly, and it depends how you define vocational education, but the community college sector, which is where a lot of skills training and professional education occurs in this country, is the fastest growing sector of American higher education, has been for the last 30 years. So a lot is invested into vocational or professional education that is happening at the community college level. A majority of students enrolled in American higher education are enrolled in community colleges. And one of the interesting things about the community college sector is not only is it the biggest sector, it's also the least expensive sector. And in comparison to the reports you read in the newspapers about climbing college costs and limited access, the community college sector is truly one that is affordable for almost anybody who has a college or a high school diploma and a desire to get some additional education. At the same time, there are plenty of community colleges that in some ways are seen as inferior, and a lot of that has to do with some of the class distinctions around vocational or workers' education, dating all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Your historical examples were great in demonstrating, really this is not just public good, but really U.S. national security interest as we've, made those kind of improvements over time. The conclusion you come to, we have these challenges ahead of us as far as growing costs and so forth. I just wonder, what's the potential from a government leadership role to increase the potential for international students, part of the diversity equation perhaps, that would maybe be a win-win across the board. As we're widening our horizons around the world, what could be that potential to really help us?
Sure. I think that is sort of the next phase. It seems already NYU has gone probably more global than any other institution in the United States. Plenty of other institutions have for a long time since the Cold War had educational study abroad opportunities as part of their overall educational mission. Again, it's part of that changing definition of what it means to be an educated person, and an educated citizen. Not just one educated kind of in the contiguous 48 states, but one where an education will be rounded out by this study abroad experience that will give you a more global sort of perspective. And in fact, many universities, major universities, University of Virginia, for example, and a whole bunch of other ones, including Vanderbilt, have established international offices to coordinate and organize this part of the undergraduate educational experience to make it a greater fixture in the education of our students. So,
And also international students coming to the United
sure,
States.
and the give and take that occurs. That's right. And again, that dates back to the post-World War II era. By 1960, we had 60,000 students come into the United States from abroad using the Fulbright program, many more coming via other mechanisms and private agencies and exchange programs and so on. So yes, that is definitely part of the current situation, and I think it is part of the future. One more question? Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thank you for coming.